Hey everyone, welcome back to HarshiLearn, your ultimate destination for mastering C Sharp. Today, we are exploring one of the most powerful tools in programming, the for loop. Whether you are a beginner or an experienced developer, understanding loops is a key to writing efficient and structured code. So stay tuned and let's dive deep into C Sharp for loops with real world examples and best practices. Let's get started. Now, let's understand loops in C Sharp. Think about a simple task like counting from 1 to 10. You could write 10 separate console.writeline statements. But that's not efficient, right? This is where loops come in. Loops allow us to execute a block of code multiple times without repeating ourselves. In C Sharp, we have different types of loops, but today let's focus on two of the most commonly used ones, for and for each. The for loop is perfect when you already know how many times a loop should run. Think of it like a countdown timer. It starts at a known point and decreases step by step until it reaches 0. The for each loop, on the other hand, is designed for collections like arrays or lists. Instead of worrying about indexes, you can simply tell, hey, go through every item in this collection and do something with it. Okay, by understanding these two loops, you can automate repetitive tasks and process data efficiently and write cleaner and more readable code. So let's dive in and see them in action. Let's talk about for loop in C Sharp. It's one of the most commonly used loops, especially when you know exactly how many times a task needs to be repeated. Instead of writing a repetitive code, the for loop automates the process efficiently. Let's see how does it work. It follows a structured format with three key parts. The first one is initialization. This is where we set up a starting point, usually by declaring a variable. And the next one is condition. The loop runs as long as this condition is true. If the condition becomes false, the loop stops. Okay. And the next one is iteration. Like after each cycle, the counter updates. Either it will decrease or it may increase. Okay. It will bring the loop closer to its stopping point. For example, imagine you're climbing a staircase with exactly 10 steps. Okay. You start at step 1, means that is your initializing. Okay. You continue climbing until you reach the top, means that is your condition. So after each step, you move on to the next one, that is iteration. Okay. The loop ensures you don't climb forever, it stops when you reach the final steps. Correct. So next time you need to repeat a task or specific number of times, just use for loop. Okay. It's like a setting an automatic alarm for your code. Now that we understand how a for loop works, let's look at a simple example like counting from 1 to 5. Okay. First, I need to add a for loop here. Inside this for loop, I need to do the initialization. So int I is equal to 1. That means we are starting counting from 1. Okay. Next, I need to specify the condition I less than or equal to 5. That means this loop runs as long as I is less than or equal to 5. Okay. Next, I need to add the iteration here. That means I plus plus. After each cycle, this I will going to increase by 1. Okay. Inside this for loop, let me use this console.writeline. It will print iteration numbers. Okay. Plus I. Let me close this. Okay. What happens is when we run this loop, on the first run, I is equal to 1. Okay, so it prints iteration 1 here. Then I increases to 2 and then it prints iteration 2 and so on. Okay, this continues until this I becomes 5. Once I becomes 6, the condition fails and the loop stops. Okay, let me run this. Yes, here you can see this loop efficiently prints number from 1 to 5 without manually writing 5 console.writeline statement. Okay. Now, let's see how a for loop can count down instead of up. Okay, for example, imagine you're launching a rocket, you need to count down before takeoff. Okay, first we need to declare a for loop here. The first one is initialization. Correct. Int I is equal to 5. That means we are starting at 5. After initialization, we need to specify the condition I greater than 0. That means this loop continues as long as this I is greater than 0. After that, I minus minus. It means the value of I decreases by 1 after each iteration. Okay. Inside this for loop, let me use this console.writeline and let me print this iterations. Okay. Or instead of this, let me print countdown down plus I. Okay. So once this I reaches 0, the loop stops just like a real countdown. Let me run this. Yes, here you can see the output. Countdown 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Now, let's see how we can control the step size of a loop. Like instead of increasing I by 1, we'll jump by 2 to print only even numbers. Okay. For that, first we need to initialize I is equal to 0. That means we are starting from 0 and we need to add the condition here I less than or equal to 10. That means this loop continues until I reaches 10 and next instead of I plus plus will increase I by 2 each time. Okay, I plus is equal to 2. Inside this for loop, let me add this console.writeline. Let me print even number plus I. Okay. So let me run this code. Yes, here you can see 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Okay. This is great when you need to process every second item in a list or to generate even numbers. I hope you understood this. Now, let's see how nested for loop works. Nested for loop is nothing but a for loop inside another for loop. Okay, this helps us to handle more complex patterns. Here, let's generate a multiplication table from 1 to 5. Okay, for that, first we need a for loop here. Let me initialize it. Int I is equal to 1. I need to add the condition I less than or equal to 5. I plus plus. Inside this for loop, let me create another for loop. Int j is equal to 1, j less than or equal to 10, and j plus plus. Inside this, let me print console dot write line I into j plus I will add one tab space here. Okay. Instead of write line, let me use write. Just write. After this loop, let me add one line console dot write line. Okay, this outer for loops run from 1 to 5. It represents rows. Okay, and this inner for loop runs from 1 to 10, and this represents columns. And this each number in the table is calculated as I into j. I'll run this code. Yes, here you can see the multiplication table here from 1 to 5. I hope you understood how nested for loops works. Now, let's see how for loops help us to work with arrays. Okay, as you know, array stores multiple values, and using this for loop, we can efficiently go through each element one by one. Let's see. Let me delete this. First, let me declare an integer array. Int numbers is equal to 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. Okay, now let me declare a for loop here. Int I is equal to 0, I less than numbers dot length, I plus plus. Console dot write line. Let me print the number plus numbers of I. Let me add a semicolon here. So we are starting from the first element at the index 0, and here you can see in the condition I less than numbers dot length, means the loop runs until it reaches a last index, means till 50. Okay, then I plus plus, and it moves to the next element after each cycle. Let me run this. Yes, here you can see it printed all the array elements here, 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. Now that we have seen the for loop and how it works with simple examples, let's talk about an even simpler way to loop through collections, the for each loop. The for each loop is designed especially for iterating over collections like arrays, lists, dictionaries, and more without needing an index. Okay, instead of manually tracking position, for each loop automatically retrieves each element one by one. Using this for each loop, we no need to manage index variables, and it prevents out of bound errors, and it makes code cleaner and easier to read. Let's see the syntax of this for each loop. This var item represents the current element in the collection. Okay, this collection is nothing but an array or a list that we are looping through, and this loop automatically moves to the next element until all the items are processed. For example, you can think it of like picking an apples from a basket. So you don't need to count them all, you just grab each one until the basket is empty. In the same way, for each loop works. So you don't need to worry about the index when you're using this for each loop. Okay. Let's explore how for each loop works with an array. Imagine you have a basket full of fruits and you want to take out each one and name it. Instead of manually tracking how many fruits are there in basket, you simply pick them one by one until the basket is empty. That's exactly how for each loop works. It automatically goes through each item in a collection without needing an index. Let me define a string here. String array fruits is equal to apple, banana, and cherry. Now I'll use this for each loop. String fruit in fruits. Now I need to print this fruit using this console dot write line. Print fruit. Okay. Let me add semicolon here. This for each loop takes each element from this fruits array one by one. Okay, and see here you can see this variable fruit. This stores the current item from the array, and this loop continues until all the elements in this array are processed. Okay, here you can see we are not using any index or length check here. Okay, this for each loop handles everything for you. Let me run this. Yes, here you can see it printed all the fruits name here: apple, banana, and cherry. I hope you understood how for each loop works with an array. Now, let's see how for each loop works with a dictionary. A dictionary is like a class attendance register. It holds information in a key value format. The key represents something unique like student ID, and the value holds additional details like student's name. Okay, using this for each loop, we can effortlessly go through each entry and retrieve both ID and name. Let me declare a dictionary here. Dictionary, as I said, it's a key value pair. Okay, int string. This integer will hold the student ID and the string will hold student name. Okay, let me give some name to this dictionary. Students is equal to new dictionary. Let me add some values. 37 ID and the name is Harshita BR. And 38 and the name is Harshita P. And the next ID is 39 Hemant Naidu. Okay, we need to add semicolon here. Now I'll use for each loop where student in students array. I'm using this console dot write line. First, let me print ID. Student dot key. Okay, and next let me print name here, that is student dot value. I'll add semicolon here. This for each loop goes through each key value pair in this dictionary. Okay, this student dot key holds the student unique ID and the student dot value holds student's name. Okay, this loop continues until all the key value pairs are processed. Let me run this code. Yes, here you can see the student ID is 37 and the student name is Harshita BR, and the student ID is 38 and student name is Harshita P, and the student ID is 39 and the student name is Hemant Naidu. Now that we have looked at how for and for each loop works, let's compare them and understand when to use each one. Both loops help us to repeat tasks, but they serve different purposes. Let's break it down. For loop is best when you need full control over number of iterations. And for each loop is ideal when you're working with collections like arrays, lists, and dictionaries. Let's look at the key differences. Use for loop when you know exactly how many times the loop should run. Okay. And use for each loop when you want to go through collections without worrying about indexes. And if we see performance, for loop is faster for indexed access like in arrays, okay, since it directly retrieves elements. But for each loop is slightly slower because it doesn't use indexes, but it's cleaner and easier to read. And for loop allows modifying elements inside the loop. Okay, but for each loop provides only read access to elements. Modifying them inside the loop is not allowed in for each loop. And for loop is best for arrays, numeric operations, and situations where you need custom increments. But for each loop is best for collections like lists and dictionaries where you just need to access values. You may ask how to decide which loop to use. Correct. Use for loop when you need precise control like counting numbers, modifying elements, or skipping specific steps. And use for each loop when you're working with collections where you don't need to modify elements, you just want to iterate through them easily. Okay, that's it. Now you know exactly when to use for and when to use for each loop. Alright, that's a wrap for today's session. We have seen how for and for each loop works with some examples. For loops gives you full control over iterations and it's perfect for numbers and when you need to update values. And for each loop make working with collections easy and keeping your code clean and readable. So picking the right loop make your code more efficient and easier to maintain. And one quick tip you need to remember is use for loop when you need precisions and use for each loop when you're dealing with collections. Okay, so the best way to get better is practice. So write your own loops and see them in action. So that's it for today's session. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, happy coding and have a great day.